I think coming last, I have the honor and the challenge of bringing together a number of thoughts that I heard in the past couple of days, which means connecting some of the dots that some of you have been putting on the table. It's challenging because many things have been said already, but it's also an opportunity to connect some of these ideas. I come from the OECD, and I would like to thank the organizers for having invited me to make this intervention here today. I don't know how many of you know the OECD, but the OECD works with governments. So the audience, the clients that I have in my daily work are policymakers. And some of you have been mentioning policymakers in the past presentations or in the questions. And I think there are not that many here in the audience, whereas there are many technologists, many data scientists, many academics. And I am myself, as a background, not a technologist. I'm not a technical person. I am study political science with a legal and economic background, and my job is to work with policymakers to make what we've been talking about here for the couple of days a reality. Meaning, if I look at the role that governments have in the current world, the role of government, and I think it was Professor Giovannini who started talking about the government as a platform. This is not a new concept. This is something we've been hearing for quite some time, but the context in which policymakers are operating right now has changed. It's continuously changing, I would say, but has changed as a result of the increasing relevance that data is being given in the policymaking process. It's a context in which new technologies are creating new forms of engagement with the public, are creating new forms of expectations from the civil society, from the private sector, from the world of services users, either being citizens or businesses, in the way they interact with the public sector that designs policies and service delivery modes and offers services, but also it's an expectation to be served in a different way. I am a taxpayer, and maybe I want to pay my taxes using my mobile phone, whereas my neighbor still wants to go to the physical office or wants to go online to do it. So these are all continuous pressures that are emerging for governments, which is continuously being asked to provide opportunities, not only to be the sole the sole provider of services, but provide opportunities, provide this platform in which different stakeholders can come together to co-create ideas, to co-create services, to provide opportunities for services to be accessed, but also to collaborate with governments. So in this context, we started a project now a couple of years ago because we were asked by governments how to be a platform, how to use the resources, and the resources in a more efficient way to have governments and public sectors which are more innovative, more participatory, more open. And the project that we started working on is called Data-Driven Public Sector. Why? Because in order for governments to be able to act as a platform, they need to recognize the value of people, of money, and of data as key strategic assets. Therefore, the whole idea is how can governments utilize data, which we've been talking about a lot for the past couple of days, for having more efficient and effective policy-making processes. So this, for having a public sector, which is a data-driven public sector, first of all, data needs to be recognized as a key asset. And second, data needs to be managed and used to design, deliver, and monitor how policies are offered and how services are provided. So I am engaged in making policymakers understand these concepts, but transform them into reality. I'm not going to go bureaucratic, but I just tell you that the way we help governments at the OECD is through a number of tools, and one of these tools are what we call legal instruments. They are not binding like directives of the European Union, but they are instruments that, for instance, in this case is a recommendation that has principles which, in simple terms, tells governments what they should do to improve policy making in a specific domain. So these are instruments that the governments willingly accept to adopt, so they commit to take actions in terms of policies and concrete initiatives to transform what this recommendation says into reality. 3 years ago, the countries members of the OECD plus 10 countries that are not members of the organizations that they willingly accepted to adopt the recommendation decided and stated and agreed that when designing digital government strategies, meaning strategies that look at how to use technology to better serve the constituents, they would focus on creating context within the public sectors that recognize the relevance of data. Meaning, if you look at the principle that is circled, it focuses on the creation of a data-driven culture within public sectors. So the point is, how can we help governments and public sectors making this a reality? First of all, it's extremely important that, to keep a focus on the fact that there's a value chain, there's a circle that needs to be put in place for being able to produce value out of data. Because it's a little bit like when we talk about open data and we work with governments on their open data policies and initiatives, there's not much value, we all know, that is being created by having a high number of data sets on the portal. If nobody uses the data, what's the value? How's the value being created? Similarly, in this case, the whole focus that we have in working with governments is trying to make them understand that there are a certain number of actions that need to be undertaken for data to be transformed into information, to be transformed into knowledge, that then becomes a basis for supporting better policy making. So what kind of value, in our perspective, can governments derive from a data-driven approach within their operations and activities? There are three main areas which cover the whole policy-making cycle that governments are engaged in, which is foresight, delivery, and performance, where we think that a stronger focus on using data, on recognizing the value of data as a key asset and using data as a key asset can bring for governments with the purpose of having as a goal a more sustainable and inclusive governance. In terms of foresight, and I'm saying things that have been said in the past couple of days. None of this is like a big surprise, but I'm trying to bring all this together. So how can data help the foresight phase? Well, data can certainly help understand and spot trends in societal needs, for instance, or economic trends that can push the approach to policy making from being reactive to being proactive. So this can really help governments to have a more forward-looking, evidence-based approach that instead of waiting for problems to emerge, to find solutions, can help governments anticipate problems. This is something that is quite common in the private sector, but not many public sectors are actually organized in using data to have this forward-looking approach and to foresee and anticipate problems. This can help having more efficient and effective delivery of policies and services. Why? Because data can, for instance, help understand where the user's preferences will be, and this can help, therefore, understand how to reorganize service delivery across a city, where to locate energies and efforts where the services are mostly accessed using specific channels, for instance, so reorganizing and redirecting energies and civil servants in the delivery of service. There's a lot of energy put in this domain in the case of digital welfare, for instance, in Nordic countries that have seen big opportunity to better serve segments of the population and also to better use their public resources. But it can also strengthen this shift and this focus from a user-centered perspective to a user-driven perspective. All of us who've been working in the e-gov and digital government domain for quite some time are familiar with the whole idea of the shift from having a government-centered approach to having a user-centered approach in the design and the delivery of services. Well, now the whole idea is how can we help the users drive our decisions on how we better serve them. And data can definitely help governments understand and give the opportunity to the users to get into the picture and to actually be driving the decision on the delivery of services. Performance, we've been hearing a lot, and I'm not going to say how new sources of data can complement traditional statistical input to monitor what we do, to evaluate what we do as public sectors, to identify new ways to be more efficient. But I think it's also important to remember that this innovative context within public sectors where we have organizations which are learning organizations. So we don't rely only anymore on traditional capacity building or training approaches to make sure that our civil servants use the data and use the evidence on what's happening, on the impact that their actions or that policies have to learn and to adapt the behavior. All this can help strengthen sustainable governance, sustainable in the sense of being able to better serve all segments of the population, like we just heard also in the previous presentation. Sustainable because it can function on more efficient organizational models. More sustainable because it can help anticipating future trends. but also more inclusive because it can help better serve different segments of the population and can include and engage in the policy-making process a higher number of stakeholders. Some examples. I think it's been very interesting in the past couple of days how we heard concrete examples that provide, let's say, a factual reference to very nice concepts. And that's why I'm going to give you 3 examples. There are many more out there, and some of you have given great testimony of what they're doing. So I'm just going to give 3 quick examples that show what do we mean by what I just said in the previous slide. First of all, the first example is from Japan, and it concerns a data-driven foresight value. Japan has been using the data on, that came from the 2011 earthquake on the behavior of the victims, for instance, to try to understand in the eventuality of a similar event in the future, how to redirect traffic to avoid traffic congestions, for instance, which would have an impact on the number of victims. This to say that data can be utilized not only to anticipate future natural disasters, but also to adopt new, to design, to, let's say, conceive new strategic approaches to the management of natural disasters and to avoid a number of victims that can be avoided. In terms of data-driven delivery, I have here an example from France. The French government has been crowdsourcing data on rooftops across the country to better guide decisions which are environmental related decisions. Policy decisions. So the input was on preferences and on citizens' feelings vis-a-vis rooftop across the country. These data were inputted in an open source geographic database, and these data were used to teach a machine learning algorithm on how to analyze 48 million data on rooftop in the whole country to guide decisions on solar panel, for instance, and on the impact of green vegetation on rooftops on the quality of air. So this was a way to bring together input crowdsourced from citizens on their behaviors, on their preferences, with data analytics, so machine input, to provide basis, knowledge, evidence for improved policy making that would guide investments on rooftops across the whole country, but as part of environmental related policy making. And last, this is an example from New York City on data-driven performance. Many of you might be familiar with this example. The mayor's office took data on a large number of data on private properties to spot highly dangerous houses across the city of New York, and by cross-tabulating this very large amount of data, the inspectors decreased enormously the time that they needed to inspect houses, to identify highly dangerous houses where, for instance, fires could explode very rapidly, producing deaths across the city. And at the same time, by doing so, the likelihood of victims resulting from these fires has decreased. This to say that, in this case, the use of data had an impact on the performance of the civil servants, but at the same time had an impact on the policy as such, on the actions as such, as it had a direct impact on lives, on people's lives. So if it is so nice, the question is data-driven public sector a reality across countries? The answer is unfortunately not yet. There's a lot of work that policymakers still need to do to make sure that this becomes a reality. I'm not going to go in details through all the challenges that you see on the slide. This is something we're working on at the moment, but I'm going to mention some of the main areas that are still limiting the development of data-driven approaches across public sector. First of all, still there are too many strategies out there, the digital government strategy, the innovation strategy, the risk management strategy, and so on, which embed the idea, the concept, the forward-looking approach of a data-driven public sector, but often they're not aligned, which means that there are not synergies being captured, and which means that often there are investments that are happening in terms of efforts of financial investments in all different directions. There's dispersed, for instance, political leadership support. Second, it's still very difficult to obtain useful data across administration. for availability reasons, for low quality reasons, or for relevance reasons, meaning much of the data available within the public sector is not necessarily available for civil servants to share. Therefore, there are huge problems in terms of data sharing, in terms of data discoverability, and in terms of data interoperability. Semantic interoperability, technical problems, and organizational resistance are blocking the flow of data within public sectors. Still, skills that are supportive to a data-driven public sector are not widely available. I'm not only talking about technical skills. We talked about skills in previous presentations today and yesterday. The whole idea is how can we create a whole set of skills which are required across civil servants, but not only. How can we strengthen the awareness at the management level and among politicians, for instance, to increase the recognition on the relevance of this approach, which translates then into incentives being provided to civil servants to actually have a more data-driven approach, but also the support to have trainings, for instance, to retrain civil servants who maybe have not been hired 20 years ago with a specific set of skills. Last but not least, there's a problem with legitimacy and trust. True, a data-driven public sector can increase public trust because it can reinforce public sector transparency, accountability, and integrity, but at the same time, we heard the relevance of ethical questions which still have to be solved, for instance, meaning to what extent, where is the trade-off between letting the decision on policies be driven by an algorithm and the need to make sure that this doesn't create new forms of divides, new forms of exclusions, or biases. The answers are not there yet, but there's for sure one aspect that needs to be taken into consideration, which is the governance of these changes. In 2014, we ran a digital government performance survey across our countries, and back then, only about 20% of countries had already created a position of a chief data officer, meaning that 20% of the countries had recognized the relevance of data as a key strategic resource for policy making. Now, 2 years after, if we ran the survey, probably the number has increased, but the key question is not, is it good or bad to have a chief data officer? The point is the chief data officer enabled to do his or her job, meaning does it have the political support, does it have the resources, what is the job description of this person, how is this person located within the whole policy environment or political environment in a country. Why is the governance so important? Because at the end of the day, the responsibility and the implementation of a data-driven public sector cannot lie within a single agency. This is such a cross-cutting context, domain, and let's say by nature it's a cross-cutting discourse that it can't be in the hands only of one person, so the governance of the management and use of data need to be rethought, and the governance really matters to make this successful. Now, there are questions that I'm leaving with you. It's not for them to be responded today, but it's food for thought, and they have to see about the creation of a data-driven culture within our public sectors, the creation of skills to support these, let's say, the efforts to make this a reality and to move from the myth that Professor Giovannini was talking about to a reality. And last but not least, how can we make sure that this reinforces public trust instead of damaging it? Thank you.